need to check the used names list and then write the story. The used names from the file: Robert, Derek, Cooper, Natalie, Gerald Whitmore, Elliot, Vanessa, Franklin, Warren, Miles, Serena, Harold, Arthur Doyle, Paige, Douglas, Curtis, Leonard, Simone, Nathan, Preston, Roy, Adam, Claire, Philip, Jean, Brendan, Melissa, Dorothy, Victor Caldwell, Vivian, Theodore, Constance, Renee, Walter, Owen, Howard Garrett, Calvin, Brielle, Dana, Gary Hutchins, Marcus, Kristen, Terrence. New names I'll use: Edmund, narrator, 64, retired civil engineer; Scott, son; Diane, daughter-in-law; Lorraine, Edmund's late wife; Ray, Edmund's brother/Allie; Patricia, Edmund's attorney. Scenario: Edmund spent $180K from retirement savings plus sold late wife's jewelry to help son and daughter-in-law buy a house. With a written family suite agreement, he could live there. 3 months later, they changed the locks and told him the agreement wasn't legally binding. They didn't know he'd had a real estate attorney structure it as a recorded lien on the deed. The morning I found a locksmith's van in my own driveway, I didn't say a word. I sat in my truck at the end of the cul-de-sac and watched a man in a gray uniform drill out the deadbolt on the front door. The door I'd helped my son paint last Thanksgiving, a deep navy blue that his mother always said she wanted on a house someday. I watched the locksmith pack up his tools. I watched my son's car pull out of the garage 20 minutes later without stopping. And I sat there in that truck for a long time after he was gone, just looking at a house that had my money in every beam and my wife's memory in the down payment, with a brand new lock I didn't have a key to. I want to tell you something before I start. I know how this kind of story sounds. Bitter old man, estranged from his son, probably did something wrong somewhere along the way. I've thought about that. I've turned it over in my head more times than I can count, but I also know what I did, and I know what they did. And those two things don't balance each other out no matter how long I sit with them. My name is Edmund. I'm 64 years old. I spent 31 years as a civil engineer for the county, bridges, drainage systems, the kind of infrastructure nobody thinks about until it fails. I retired the year my wife, Lorraine, was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. I wanted to be home. I needed to be home. She passed 14 months after the diagnosis, on a Tuesday morning in early March, with the bedroom window cracked open the way she always liked it, even in winter. We had one son, Scott. He was 37 when this happened. He'd married Diane 8 years before that, and I'll be honest, I never fully warmed to her, but I tried. Lorraine tried harder. She always said Diane was complicated, which was her generous way of saying something she wouldn't say outright. But Scott loved her, and Scott was our son, so we showed up. We were at every birthday, every holiday, every time they called. After Lorraine died, I rattled around in our house in Claremont for about 8 months. It's a 4-bedroom colonial we'd bought in the 90s, and without her in it, the rooms felt like they belonged to a different version of my life. I wasn't sad exactly. I was unmoored. There's a difference. Sad has a shape to it. What I felt didn't have a shape at all. Scott called me one Sunday in November. He said he and Diane had been talking. They wanted to buy a house. A real house, he said. Not the apartment they'd been in for 6 years. They'd found something in Cedarbrook, about 40 minutes from me. 4 bedrooms, a yard. Good school district for whenever they had kids. The problem was the down payment. They were short. Not a little short, significantly short. He asked if I would help. I didn't answer right away. I told him I'd think about it, and I did think about it. For about 2 weeks, sitting in the kitchen in Claremont, drinking too much coffee and looking at the numbers in my retirement accounts, and the life insurance payout from Lorraine's policy and the small pile of her jewelry that I'd been keeping in the fireproof lockbox in the closet, because I couldn't figure out what else to do with it. The jewelry wasn't worth a fortune. An appraiser told me about $22,000 for the pieces she'd had valued. her grandmother's ring, a strand of pearls, a gold bracelet from our 25th anniversary. But Lorraine had always said she wanted that jewelry to do something meaningful, not just sit. She'd said, more than once, that if anything happened to her, she hoped it would help the family somehow. I thought about that a lot during those 2 weeks. I called Scott back and I said yes. But I told him I needed something in return, and it wasn't money. I told him I was thinking about selling the Claremont house eventually. It was too big, too full of ghost rooms. And when that time came, I wanted to know I had a place to go. Not indefinitely, not to move in and take over, but I wanted a real option, a suite on the lower level of their new house, or a converted space, something with a private entrance if possible, where I could stay when I wanted to, and that I could eventually move into when I was ready to leave Claremont. Scott said that sounded completely reasonable. Diane said, and I heard her in the background, that it sounded wonderful, that she'd always wanted family close. We had a conversation about putting it in writing. I brought it up, and I want to be clear about that, because later Scott would say it was my idea, and say it like it was a character flaw. It was my idea. I had spent 31 years in civil engineering. I'd watched projects collapse because of handshake agreements. I believed in documentation the way some people believe in prayer. I contacted a real estate attorney, a woman named Patricia, who'd done some work for a colleague of mine years before. I explained the situation. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, very calmly, that what I was describing was essentially a parental equity contribution with a conditional residency. Right, and that the cleanest way to structure it was as a recorded instrument on the property. She said we could attach a lien to the deed, not an aggressive one, not something that would interfere with their mortgage, but something that would document my contribution and formalize my right to occupy a designated portion of the property under agreed-upon terms. I told her that sounded like what I needed. She drafted the documents. Scott and Diane came to her office one afternoon in December, and we all signed. The instrument was recorded with the county clerk 3 days later. The total I contributed was $183,400. That included $161,000 in liquid assets, money I had set aside from my retirement accounts and the life insurance, and $22,400 from the sale of Lorraine's jewelry. I did not tell Scott about the jewelry until the day we signed. When I told him, he looked at the table and said, "Dad, you didn't have to do that." I said I knew. I wanted to. They closed on the house in January. For the first 4 months, things were fine. Better than fine, actually. I visited on weekends sometimes. The lower level was partly finished. A large open space with its own exterior door, a full bathroom, and a utility room. Diane had started talking about putting a Murphy bed in there, maybe a small kitchen area. Scott seemed happy. I felt, for the first time since Lorraine died, like I was moving in a direction instead of just standing still. And then things got quieter. My calls started going to voicemail more often. When I did visit, Diane seemed distracted, busy with something on her phone, leaving the room frequently. Scott seemed fine on the surface, but there was something slightly off in the way he answered questions. A half-second delay, like he was deciding something before he spoke. In May, I drove out on a Saturday without calling ahead. I know some people consider that rude. I didn't think I needed to call ahead to come to a place where my name was on a legal instrument. I pulled up and the house looked normal. Diane's car was in the driveway. I knocked. She answered, and the look on her face when she saw me, she recovered quickly, but I saw it. It was the look of someone who has been caught not at anything specific, but just at not expecting you. She was polite. She offered me coffee. Scott wasn't home, she said. She asked if I'd called ahead, and I said no, I was just passing through. We sat in the kitchen for about 45 minutes, and she talked about the house, about a project at her job, about a friend's engagement. Normal things, but when I mentioned the lower level, mentioned that I'd been thinking about having a contractor come look at the space, she paused in a way that lasted a beat too long before she said, "Oh, we've actually been thinking about that too." I drove home and sat in the Claremont kitchen and turned that sentence over for a while. 2 weeks later, Scott called me. He said he and Diane had been talking and they'd realized the lower level conversion was going to be more complicated and more expensive than they'd originally thought. He said they loved me and they wanted me close, but they were also thinking about starting a family soon and they might need that space for a nursery or a home office, and they wanted to be honest with me. I asked him about the agreement we'd signed. He said, and I'm going to quote this because I remember it exactly. He said, "Dad, I talked to a friend who does real estate law, and he said that document is probably not enforceable as a residency agreement. You'd have to take us to court, and you'd probably lose, and neither of us wants that." I was quiet for a long time, long enough that he asked if I was still there. I said I was still there. I said I appreciated him being honest with me. I asked him if there was any chance he'd like to have a conversation about this in person, and he said he thought it was better to handle it over the phone for now. I said okay. I said I'd think about what he said. I called Patricia the next morning. She listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Edmund, what you signed is a recorded lien on the deed. That means it appears in the title search. They cannot sell that property, refinance it, or transfer it without resolving your claim. Your son's friend gave him very bad advice." I asked her what my options were. She walked me through them. I could assert the lien if they attempted to sell or refinance. I could pursue a breach of the residency agreement, which would likely result in monetary damages even if the physical residency was complicated to enforce. Or I could simply wait and let them discover the lien the next time they needed to do anything with the title. I asked her how long liens like this typically sat before they surfaced. She said it depended entirely on when they tried to sell, refinance, or take out a home equity line of credit. I thanked her. I told her to keep the file active, but to hold off on any action for now. Then I went home, and I started quietly doing some things. The first thing I did was call my brother Ray. Ray is 4 years younger than me, and he is, without question, the most practically organized person I have ever known. He spent 20 years managing logistics for a regional distribution company, and he approaches problems the way I approach engineering. He wants to understand the system before he touches anything. I told Ray everything. He listened. When I finished, he said, "Okay, so you have the lien. What else do you have?" I told him I had every bank transfer record, every communication where Scott or Diane had discussed the lower level arrangement, and the signed documents. He said, "Good, keep all of it somewhere they can't access." The second thing I did was stop calling Scott on his schedule. For months I had been accommodating, calling when it was convenient, not pushing when calls went unanswered. I stopped accommodating. I didn't call at all. I waited to see how long it would take him to notice. It took 3 weeks before he called me. He asked how I was doing, casual, like we'd spoken recently. I said I was fine. I said I was fine. I said I'd been keeping busy. I didn't mention the house. Neither did he. We talked for about 15 minutes about nothing in particular, and then he said he had to go. Then came the morning in August. I'd driven out to Cedarbrook for a reason. I had an appointment with a local contractor I'd found, someone who worked on finished basements and lower-level conversions. I wanted an independent estimate on what the conversion would actually cost, for the record. I'd not told Scott I was coming, for the record. When I pulled onto the street, the locksmith's van was in the driveway. I parked at the end of the cul-de-sac. I watched the whole thing. New deadbolt on the front door. New hardware on the side gate. The locksmith loaded up his van and drove away. Scott's car was there. About 20 minutes after the locksmith left, Scott's car backed out of the garage. I watched it go past. He didn't look toward the end of the street. He was on the phone. I sat there for another half hour. I thought about Lorraine. I thought about her jewelry and how she'd said she wanted it to do something meaningful. I thought about the strand of pearls she wore to Scott's college graduation. I thought about what she would say if she were here. I decided she would say, "Be precise." She was always the one telling me to be precise with people, to say exactly what I meant instead of hinting around it. She said vagueness was a kindness you offered to people who didn't deserve it. I drove to Patricia's office without an appointment. Her assistant, to her credit, fit me in within the hour. I told Patricia what I'd seen. I told her I was ready to move forward. She nodded slowly. She said, "I want to look at something first." She pulled up the county property records on her computer and went through the title. She confirmed the lien was still there, recorded and intact. She also found something neither of us had anticipated. 3 weeks prior, Scott and Diane had applied for a home equity line of credit. The application was in the system. It had not yet been approved. Patricia looked at me. "They would have hit your lien during the title review," she said. "The bank's title examiner would have flagged it. That process is probably already in motion." We found out the following week that the HELOC application had been denied. Not just flagged, denied outright, pending resolution of the recorded instrument. The bank's letter cited the lien by document number. Scott called me 4 days after that. The call came at 8:47 in the morning. I was having coffee. I let it go to voicemail. He left a message asking me to call him back, said it was important, said it was about the house, said it was time sensitive. I listened to that voicemail 3 times. Then I made myself another cup of coffee, and I called Patricia. She advised me on exactly what to say and what not to say. Then she sent a formal letter to Scott and Diane through their attorney, because by that point they'd hired one, outlining the terms under which I would consider releasing or restructuring the lien. Those terms were not punitive. I wasn't trying to take the house. I'm not that man. I asked for 3 things: reimbursement of the $22,400 from Lorraine's jewelry, return to a trust in her name that I would use for a charitable donation she had always talked about making, formal termination of any verbal understandings about my not having standing on the property, and a written acknowledgement that the residency agreement remained valid, with a timeline to complete the lower-level conversion within 18 months. I want to be clear about something. I could have demanded more. Patricia told me I had significant leverage. I wasn't interested in leverage for its own sake. I was interested in what was right. Scott's attorney came back with a counter. Diane wanted to remove the residency clause entirely in exchange for a cash payment above the jewelry reimbursement. I won't say the number she proposed because, frankly, it doesn't matter. It wasn't the point. I turned it down through Patricia. Then Scott called me himself, not through the attorney. Just called me early on a weekday morning, and when I answered, his voice had a quality I hadn't heard since he was very young. Not angry, not strategic, just tired. He said, "Dad, I need to talk to you." I said okay. He came to the Claremont house that afternoon. He sat at the kitchen table, the same kitchen table he'd eaten breakfast at for 18 years, and he looked like he hadn't slept. He told me that Diane had convinced him the agreement was unenforceable. He told me that she had been the one to contact the friend who gave them that legal opinion. He told me that the HELOC was for a home renovation she'd been planning without telling him the full budget, and that he'd only recently found out the total number. He didn't excuse himself. He said, "I went along with it, and that's on me." I looked at my son for a long time. I thought about the morning I'd taught him to ride a bike in a church parking lot over on Henderson Avenue, how he'd cried when he fell the 3rd time and then gotten back on without me asking him to. I thought about who he used to be and who he'd somehow gotten lost from being. I said, "I'm not trying to take your house, Scott." He said he knew. I said, "But I need to know that your mother's jewelry means something, that it did something real." He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said he understood. We worked it out, Scott and I, not through attorneys in the end. Diane was not in the room. I want to be careful about what I say about her, because I don't know everything that drove her decisions, and I don't think it's useful to make her the sole villain of this story, when my son made his own choices at every step. What I will say is that the revised agreement we signed, a new one, with Patricia's oversight, addressed everything I'd asked for. The jewelry reimbursement went into a donor-advised fund I set up in Lorraine's name. The residency clause stayed. The lower-level conversion was given a hard deadline. An independent contractor was already on record. The HELOC was eventually approved once the lien situation was resolved to the bank's satisfaction. I sold the Claremont house the following spring. I moved into the lower level in Cedarbrook in late June, into a space that had a new kitchenette along the east wall, a proper bedroom, and a private door that opened to the side yard where there was a magnolia tree that reminded me, somehow, of nothing specific and everything at once. I want to end with what I actually learned, because I don't think this story is about revenge. I've thought about that word a lot, and I don't think it fits. Revenge implies you want them to suffer. I didn't want Scott to suffer. I wanted him to choose differently. Those are not the same thing. What I learned is that precision is not coldness. I spent a lot of years thinking that putting things in writing was a form of distrust, that if you love someone, you should be able to rely on their word. Lorraine used to push back on that. She'd say that a written agreement protects both people, not just the skeptical one. She was right. The lien I recorded wasn't a trap. It was just clarity. It said, "This is real, this counts, this matters enough to be stated plainly." I also learned that you can love someone and still hold a boundary with both hands. That's not a contradiction. That's just being honest about what you need. I still have coffee with Scott on Sunday mornings, most weeks. We don't talk about that year very often. When we do, it's carefully, the way you talk about a section of road that washed out once. You acknowledge it happened. You acknowledge it was serious. And then you keep driving. I miss Lorraine every day. I think she would have handled all of this better than I did, and with less paperwork. But she would have also told me she was glad I didn't just give the house back without a fight. She always said the people who love you will be glad you stood firm. The ones who aren't glad, that tells you something too. I think about that a lot, sitting by the side door watching the magnolia tree in the morning, drinking my coffee while the neighborhood wakes up around me. It's a quiet kind of life. It took me a while to understand that quiet is not the same as empty. It took me a while to come home. I've had a lot of time to think about what actually happened. Not the legal part, not the documents, but the human part underneath all of it. What I keep coming back to is this. The choices Scott made didn't happen all at once. They happened in small steps. Each one a little easier than the last, because the previous one had already been made. First, it was letting Diane handle the conversation with the attorney friend. Then, it was going along with what that friend said without telling me. Then, it was the locksmith. Each step had its own small justification, and I think Scott probably believed every single one of them in the moment. That's not an excuse. It's just what I think is true, and I'd rather be honest about it than make him into something simpler than he actually is. The thing about consequences is that they don't announce themselves ahead of time. They just arrive. The HELOC denial arrived. The attorney's letter arrived. And eventually the morning at my kitchen table arrived, when my son sat down looking like he hadn't slept in a week and said the words I'd been waiting months to hear, not because I wanted him to suffer, but because I needed to know he could still find his way back to himself. I did something right, I think, when I called Patricia the first time. Not because it gave me leverage, though it did, but because it forced the situation to be real. When everything is verbal, when nothing is written down, the truth can be whatever the room decides it is that day. When something is recorded with the county clerk, the truth has a fixed address. I learned that from 30 years of engineering. The structure either holds the load or it doesn't. There's no version of the bridge where it kind of holds. Lorraine understood this better than I did about people. She used to say that the clearest thing you can do for someone you love is to be honest about your expectations before anything goes wrong, not after. I thought I was doing that when I insisted on the written agreement. I was, but I also think I underestimated how much the people around us can drift from who we believe them to be. Not because they're bad, but because they're human. And humans respond to pressure and influence in ways that surprise even themselves. What I want to say to anyone who's ever been in a position even slightly like mine is this. Clarity is not aggression. Protecting yourself is not the same as attacking someone. I did not take my son's house. I did not humiliate him publicly. I did not go looking for a fight. I simply refused to pretend that $183,000, the last of my retirement savings and the last of his mother's jewelry, was a gift with no meaning, no record, and no weight. It had weight. It still does. The three things I'd tell my younger self, or anyone who asks: be precise about what you need before the money moves, not after. Keep every record, not because you expect the worst, but because clarity protects everyone. And understand that holding a boundary firmly is an act of respect for yourself. And eventually, if they're willing, for the person on the other side of it too. Scott and I still have coffee on Sunday mornings. We're still finding our way back to each other. That matters more to me than anything the attorneys sorted out. But we only have that because someone, at some point, refused to let the whole thing dissolve into silence and denial. That someone turned out to be me. I didn't expect that. I'm glad it was.